Hi, everyone. Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for our fourth and final panel. And on this panel, we are going to be discussing reflections, being a mid-career psychologist and what that looks like. And again, we have our lovely graduate student, Julie, who's going to be moderating the event. And with that, I'm going to let her take it away.
Perfect. Well, I am back, and I'm actually extremely happy to introduce our last panel of the evening because I've had the fortunate experience of being mentored, supervised, and taught by everyone here today. So first, Dr. Kayoko Yokoyama. She is a licensed clinical psychologist who runs her own private practice and sees various individual and diverse clients. And she is also an adjunct faculty at JFK University as well as the Wright Institute. And her areas of interest include feminist therapy, social justice training, and women's issues. And next, we have Dr. Helen Su. She is a staff psychologist and lecturer at Stanford University. She is the immediate past president of the Asian American Psychological Association, and she's the current chair of the APA Minorityship Fellowship Program. That's awesome. And lastly, we have Dr. Elizabeth Pierce. She has a passion for providing therapy, psychological assessment, supervision, and training. She is the clinical supervisor at the Hume Center, and she was mine as well. And she is the adjunct professor at Alliant International University, where she also earned her doctorate degree. And she specializes in working with clients with complex trauma as well as different developments. And so, again, we're just so thankful to have all three of you here today to discuss the various challenges and the reflections that come with being a mid-career psychologist. So I just want to go ahead and jump right in with some questions. So I think I've actually had these conversations with all of you being a mentee or a student, actually. So this is actually a great question to start off this panel. So I'm wondering if either of you can share your experiences of deciding whether to use doctor versus your first name and the challenges that come with that based on being asked your preference across various populations. And we could go ahead and start off with Dr. Yokoyama.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here. Although, yes, in California, it's very smoky. And so I'm very aware of that right now. But pleased to be here. I think that's such a good question and something that comes up every year. They'll either just call me by my first name or they'll say, "What should I call you? Can I call you by your first name?" Like if it's at the club, call me by my first name.
Dr. Yokoyama, I just want to pause you for a brief second. We're getting some background noise. So if you can make sure to speak up just a little bit so that our viewership can hear you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So, yeah, I think this is where cultural competence begins, in my opinion, is, when students ask that question, one of the questions that I ask is, do you ask all of your professors this question? I want to know,
Nice.
Who do you ask this question to? Because they feel very free to ask me. And, I think when I was first a professor, I was young, much younger than I am now. And so I think part of that boldness of students asking me, that question was something that I wanted to explore further. And I think for students, it also became the starting point for teaching, right? This is where cultural competence comes in, because in different cultural contexts, it means different things. And so you may, I've encountered people who say, well, it's just nice when it's informal and everyone can go by their first name. And as a feminist psychologist, there is something lovely about equalizing that power. At the same time, I also want students to know that when they go to a conference, they probably shouldn't go up to someone they admire and just feel free to call them by their first name. That's not appropriate. And also just different institutional and cultural contexts, I think, require different considerations. And so being really understanding that context is very critical. And this is also a question that my white male colleagues have typically not been places in attention. So that's the start.
That is awesome that you shared that perspective. And just again, for our viewership, we are getting some background noise. So what I'm going to do is ask for the person who is not speaking to mute themselves, and see if we can improve some of that quality. And then for the next person who would like to answer that question, is there anyone else who wanted to piggyback on that?
Yeah, I can add to that. I just wanted to also say how grateful I am to be here, and that this question was, something as we were preparing for this, and Dr. Yokoyama and I were talking about it, and just started like, oh, this sounds like an interesting question. And one thing I realized is that I've never had a student ask me if they could call me by my first name. And then I thought, like, is it because I'm white? And how uncomfortable that made me feel. If it's like this, for some reason, students think that they should refer to me as doctor, and just, that hadn't occurred to me before. Is that part of the reason why no one has ever asked me that? And I've actually am used to working at the Hume Center, where we all go by first name so frequently, and I often have supervisees who have been my students before, and I will say, you can call me Libby, or you can call me Dr. Pierce, whatever you prefer. And many of my former students, and I've noticed often some of my students of color, feel more comfortable calling me Dr. Pierce. And I want to be able to respect whatever title someone would want to call me, but also just, is there something about that I am perceived as having this power, which does not feel comfortable? And I think that could be a piece of it. I don't know.
So, and Dr. Sue, any thoughts on the same question?
Not so much. I was recently on a podcast with Dr. Alfie, who's African-American, a Black psychologist, and we had that discussion too about, for her on the show, using titles was really important, especially of women of color, knowing that there are so few in our field. And for me, having been primarily in community mental health, where it's much more informal, and I actually really appreciate sort of holding all staff of importance. But then there has to be really looking at our assumptions and our patterns of equality, right? So if everybody is first name, that's one thing, but often you'll find like, oh, well, we call the psychiatrist Dr. So-and-so, but not the other doctors. And it's like, well, then there's something there that's problematic. And then there are things I think we are aware of in terms of how we come across in settings as women of color and as someone who will be mistaken for grad student for a very, very long time.
Right. And I'm sure that will be helpful to know for graduate students when we work in different settings and or for various cultural reasons on how we address someone. And when we become licensed too, it'll be a conversation that we'll have with our supervisees, with our mentors, and just being open about it and transparent. I'm glad that all three of you were able to share those cultural concerns too. And speaking of graduate students and actually kind of transitioning to another important topic they've wanted to know, they're wondering what are some ways graduate students and therapists can really advocate for BIPOC and LGBTQ plus rights. Mm-hmm. And we can start off with Dr. Sue.
Great. Well, we're in a really great space, as has mentioned in previous panels, about how can we be advocates in our various communities and in an alliance with other communities, because really that's the only way things get done. I've often said in many settings, the best part of being such an active part of the Asian American Psych Association was the work that I got to do with the leaders of ABPSI, NLPA, SIP, and Amina Psi. So, but as a student, I think it's sort of, in line with what previous panel says, looking at what you can handle in your sort of life balance, right? Not to feel too guilty about if you have some time limitations now, because trust me, the work will always be there. But right now, what can you do to advocate for what you see is missing? Because there are changes that I think many of us have seen in our institutions that only came because clients or students, the constituents, actually really, really pushed for it. And so aligning your voices, your requests, knowing that real change are things like policy change. It's fascinating to me seeing Stanford students very active, for example, on Twitter. And that's a place that they check with other campuses and shame each other's campuses, right? Like, this campus is doing this. Like, why aren't we doing that? Really speaking out about this is what's right for our communities in terms of justice, but also as a student, this is the education and the skills that I need, that I'm paying for.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I guess I can go next, or unless Dr. Yokoyama, if you would like to. Yeah, so I guess for me, it's when I think about that question, I have two different feelings towards, advocating for people of color and advocating for, the LGBTQ population. And so for me, identifying as queer and being a member of that community, but being a white person. So I feel there's a difference there. And so if it's advocating for, the LGBTQ, I feel like I can speak more from, what my personal experience is. But if it's advocacy for people of color, there's more of this conflict that I experience of, I don't know what it's like being a person of color. And am I, I don't want to guess, but also I don't want to make someone else feel like it's their responsibility to tell me. And so how, to acknowledge that I don't know what it's like, and listen and try to learn and accept, I think, having these two different, yes, being marginalized in one way and not in another. And so with my clients is, just trying to be, I think, or with students, trying to be open about what my identity is and wanting to learn how I can help when it's for a population that I'm not part of. And also, just to add, if there's something I would do that would inadvertently, unintentionally feel harmful, and I think often, being able to acknowledge that is really important if you are coming from privilege. And so.
Go ahead, Dr. Yokoyama. I think you were getting ready to say something.
Thank you. I was just going to say, I really appreciate Dr. Pierce's consideration of privilege. I think we all hold different kinds of privilege. Just being on this call, being on this panel is a form of privilege to start. And I think, this is such a great time for advocacy. And I think it's also a great time for listening and learning, So when people talk about advocacy, one of the things I want to know is what's our motivation, and what do we know? What do we know about the history? So I think, I love that the word good trouble has been, so much in our, in what we're seeing these past few weeks, thanks to John Lewis. And I do think that good trouble is really important. And so I really encourage, students and young professionals to advocate wherever they can. And I think part of that advocacy is also some humility to think about what we don't know, ways that where we, places where we need to learn. And also, asking some deep and hard questions about what do our own personal experiences look like? What experiences have we had with the community that we want to advocate for? And what do we need to learn? It's hard to, create bridges, to find friends in communities. But I think that's also where we learn so much. We learn through our close connections more about maybe some of the struggles in the community. So I think that's also another sort of great way to learn more, is just through our own, exploring our own personal connections.
Yeah. I'm glad all three of you were able to be transparent, to not only acknowledge our privilege, but also learn various ways to advocate within our community too, and just being more aware and being more sensitive and more building our cultural humility as well during this time too. And so related to the topic of the BIPOC community, this is also another great question from a graduate student. how do you educate well-meaning clinicians that not all people of color have dark skin and colonialism impacts Indigenous people differently? So you could go ahead and start with Dr. Sue.
I'm back. You know, Dr. Fan and I just had a conversation not long ago where a fair-skinned East Asian descent person like us said, well, I don't think colorism exists because I haven't experienced it, right? And so it's illustrative of how, for a well-meaning white person or clinician, but even amongst ourselves, there's so many different levels of understanding history and colonialism and all these intersecting systems of power that come into play. I think right now there's a wealth of material for cultural humility, which is really great. And it's sort of a service to sort of compile some of these, but it's also asserting our boundaries too about where is it demanding emotional labor from already marginalized communities, right? So one of the things Stanford has done is that a lot of our white staff really have gone off and they're in their own white accountability group, recognizing that too much extra work and emotional labor was already being put on the staff who were queer, who were people of color, who had specialties in those communities. So it's sort of finding that line of like, maybe in relationship, there is some exchange that I will share with you, but for the most part, there's resources here. And there's a piece about truly being an ally that cannot be done without accountability and effort and a little bit of sacrifice.
I think that's awesome that you are speaking to that. And I'm wondering if Dr. Yokoyama if you have thoughts as well.
I think it's such a good and important question. I know I've been asked by students and clients, even very recently, about, they've asked me questions like, well, what does it mean to you to be Japanese? And I've been asked this by Asian clients, both Japanese and, Asian clients and students of other ethnic groups. And one of the things that I always say is, for me, I really want to acknowledge the history of what it means to be Japanese within an Asian context. So what that means is, being Japanese is understanding that Japan, brutally treated over historically most Asian countries. And so for me, my job, I think, is to be a student of that history and also to carry that forward, not only to my, child, but also to the next generation of psychologists and students, but also with clients. I've had clients who've asked me about that. And I will say up front, because I did have a client who said, I want to explore my identity. What do you think about yours? And so for me, it was an opening just to say, there are things that I'm very proud of and things that are painful. And I've also said to white students, I don't know what it's like to be white, but I think I understand a piece of that because for me, there's a lot of shame around what it means to be Japanese. And there's also pride that I hold in what it means to be Japanese, but it's not a pride that I can ever hold without also acknowledging that there are many facets to that, including the shame of what that history has, brought to the world and brought to all these Asian countries. So that's something I always want to acknowledge. It's not, it's not something I sort of start with, but if people ask me about it, I'm always glad to try to speak to that.
Yeah, I'm glad how both of you were able to understand and acknowledge and trying to find that line in that relationship to share resources and being an ally and trying to build those relationships to connect one another, to learn how to educate them on what's going on in the world. And I really appreciate that you were able to share insight on that piece. And I know we do have some little time left, so unfortunate, but I would like to answer one big question that the graduate students really brought on today. And so how do all of you actually recommend graduate students to expand their professional development? So we could start off with Dr. Sue. It could be a very fully loaded question, but we could start off with her.
I'll try to be quick here. Many of our previous speakers talked about finding your people. If that is not geographically where you are or in your program, we've talked a lot about AAPA has been a place, the Minority Fellowship Program that I'm currently, training advisor on. What a lot of us lack if we enter this field without a ton of money or connections is that we are not legacies. Right. And so finding a place. So for example, it really came through to me that something like MFP was founded in 1972. And so at this point, it is a multi-generational professional family. And that's something that many of us don't have, and that you can find ways to be linked with people who share your values, who can connect you with the elders and the established and the opportunities, and how do we help each other build up in those ways. So really stumbling into associations and such was a gift, and it's totally made my career in every way.
And Dr. Pierce, could you speak to what you believe would be a good recommendation on how to expand professional development for graduate students?
Yeah, I can speak as well. I think, one thing that came up for me, and also from hearing Dr. Sue speak, is thinking about expanding your professional development through work or exposure to different populations. I know for me that was something that was really important. We don't have a whole lot of time left probably, but I started my graduate education in the Midwest in a very conservative area and did not get any exposure to any populations that were different in any way. And so coming to the Bay Area, I was curious, but also, what do I do? How to work with any cultural groups or backgrounds. And so really just taking that step and acknowledging that. And for all of us, we have some groups that we're a part of and some that we're not. And so really to take that exposure, as well as finding the groups that you're a part of, to find exposure to groups that you're not part of, and to see, to grow in that way as well, I think. So the connection as well as the feeling that discomfort.
Awesome. And last but not least, Dr. Yokoyama, can you speak to your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think one of the things I try to tell my students is find your academic or professional family. So that's been said. And I think for me, I try to help students not be so daunted by that prospect, because I try to let them know, I have a lot of colleagues who are very extroverted. I wouldn't say I'm very introverted, but I'm definitely not very extroverted. And so I try to tell students, don't worry, if you're introverted, if you're a little introverted like me, it's fine. It can work out for you. And for me, when I enter a room of 100 people, I have friends who want to meet all 100 people. And I love that about them. And I want to meet 2 or 3 people and have a deeper conversation. So I think we're all so different, but I do tell students sometimes that, briefly, the story of how when I went to my very first professional conference, I was so intimidated. It was actually the Winter Roundtable at Teachers College on the East Coast at Columbia University. And I was so intimidated, but I saw the name of a Japanese psychologist. And I've never seen that. It just blew my mind that could even be a possibility. And so I just marched straight to her presentation, and somehow I had the chutzpah to go up to her and say hello. And we became friends. I babysat her kids. It turns out we went to the same kindergarten. And she became a mentor, she became a really important mentor, and someone I ran into at AAPA just a couple of years ago, and we hadn't seen each other in a couple of decades. So I think, doing things like that, just a little bit out of your comfort zone, I think can lead to great things.
And I actually remember on the first day of JFK where Dr. Yokoyama told me to build my professional network. And that was the first piece of advice I definitely took on. And I remember when I started my practicum traineeship at City of Fremont, Dr. Sue definitely pushed me as well to join these organizations and just to build my professional family. And I definitely still remember Dr. Pierce, every supervision, definitely motivating me to build my network and just expand my field and just to connect with people, because in the long run, it's definitely good to network and connect, because it's just important to do that in our field and just to get to know one another as well. So I just want to say again, thank you so much. And we appreciate all of you sharing your thoughts and experiences, and also the challenges that come with being a psychologist right now, especially. And Dr. Ball, I'm just curious if you have any final thoughts on our last panel.
Oh, I just want to say thank you all for joining us and, highlighting what your experiences are right now as mid-career psychologists, and just pointing out that learning never stops, development never stops, and that, it's important to continue to grow, stay connected, and to really just know learning is ever present. So I appreciate your thoughts and sharing, and also that you're still working through conflicts on how to, deal with things or how to approach things. And that is part of being human and being professional. So I really appreciate you guys. And with that, I will say we're going to make our exits. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And